If you drive a car, you already know it costs a lot to own and operate. Unfortunately, that doesn't even begin to cover the true cost of our nation's car dependency. Infrastructure, crashes, pollution, climate impacts. There's a lot to account for. So how much does driving really cost? Well, that turns out to be a really complicated question, but today I'm going to go out in search of the real answers, sharing the best research I can find with some surprises along the way. Some of them kind of dark and some of them just straight up absurd. And it's all coming up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. Viewer suggested topics always welcome. And here's one. I read in a news article that for each dollar spent by a car user, society paid $5.77, and for each dollar spent by a bus user, society paid $1.31. How do they come up with these numbers? I think you are the only one nerdy enough to answer, smiley face. Okay, I'm a little stuck on whether that last piece is a compliment or not, but you do see this kind of thing all the time if you follow transportation stuff on the apps. And I really had to go find the one this person was talking about. It's a study out of Laval University, just outside Montreal. So it's in French, but I'll translate the money quote. Motorists always think that they're paying for other people's public transport, and it's the opposite. Or there's this one, which is based on a cost of commute calculator that was built for the Vancouver, BC region. The infographic takes the same approach of trying to capture the full cost and benefit of using different transportation modes. The calculator tries to account for not just what you personally pay out of pocket, but all the other things that society pays for, not just directly, like expensive infrastructure, but also indirectly in the cost of climate mitigation from emissions and increased healthcare costs and loss of productivity from things like pollution, physical inactivity, and crashes. Even that's just scratching the surface, but those are what we call externalities, costs to society that aren't paid directly by the producer or the consumer. I've already done a video on the private costs of owning and operating a motor vehicle, which are significant, but in today's video, the story gets a lot worse. I haven't really made a video about externalities before because they're extremely tricky to calculate. They can be pretty subjective, and sometimes it's even hard to differentiate between a non-monetary cost that's borne by an individual versus one that's borne by society. So when you see an infographic like this, it's always a bit of a black box. You don't know all the things they considered when they came up with the numbers, so today I want to dig into resources that'll help us get to a more credible answer. And you can find a lot of different studies that arrive at a lot of different numbers. So today I wanted to give you the thing that I think is closest to the right answer out of everything I've found. It's a paper from the academic journal Ecological Economics, and it's called The Social Cost of Automobility, Cycling, and Walking in the European Union. So one thing you might have noticed already is that everything I've shown you so far is either from Canada or the EU, where they apparently don't have the same cultural allergy to taking a holistic approach that we do in the US. Like, the way transportation investments happen in America is a little more ad hoc, I guess. Like, we just don't think that deeply about it. I'm not going to say it's a conspiracy, but it is in the best interest of certain industries that you just don't think about this stuff too hard. You can access this one for free, so I'll link it down in the description. And it's definitely an interesting read, and so are some of the cited works. Because what the paper does, basically, is take the best of the methodology and analyses of previous studies that have tackled this question. It reconciles a huge list of parameters, and then it builds its own benefit-cost analysis that's specific to the European Union, but I will try to translate it to an American context as best I can. So let's talk a bit about benefit-cost analyses, or I think in the EU they call them cost-benefit analyses because those people are just so pessimistic. It's basically accounting for all the benefits and all the costs of a particular project or course of action to figure out if there's a benefit to proceeding and what the magnitude of that benefit might be. It's something that makes sense on the face of it, and it's something that you would expect that any major infrastructure investment would require, but in practice, just in my professional experience, they're almost never done in the infrastructure world. And to be fair, they are difficult. A robust BCA on a mega project is extremely data intensive. It requires tons of analysis, and even then, they're subject to all kinds of tough problems, identifying and finding ways to measure every possible cost and benefit, making sure you aren't omitting anything or double counting adopting anything. And those aren't even the most contentious issues. In basically any mega project, the costs and benefits aren't distributed evenly, so just trying to analyze everything in the aggregate has tons of limitations right off the bat. And even more fundamentally, it's worth asking whether it's even valid to try to reduce everything to a dollar value, which is something you do in a BCA, but I kind of think of it as the least bad of a lot of bad options. Okay, that's kind of a lot of caveats for the paper I'm about to share, which isn't perfect, and I will critique it as we go through, but one good thing is it does acknowledge basically all the limitations of the BCA approach, and it discusses the difficulty of reconciling different parameters. Like, one of the previous studies this paper looked at accounted for the cost of car ownership as a benefit of biking, on the logic that car ownership becomes an avoided cost, which makes some intuitive sense, but doesn't work for the benefit cost framework this paper is using. They also discarded some variables that might have some validity, but were just too subjective to include, which I kind of agree with. So you could say this paper takes a bit of a conservative approach to the evaluation, but I'm someone who prefers to err on that side because overstating benefits tends to be a lot faster way to lose credibility than understating them. One more thing before we fully dive into this. The paper does get a lot of mileage out of this report from Todd Littman's Victoria Transport Policy Institute, unsurprisingly based in Canada. So if you aren't familiar with VTPI, ignore the fact that the website looks like it's from 1995. It's actually got tons of great resources that still get updated pretty frequently, including their guidebook on doing transportation BCAs, also linked down in the description. Okay, the paper does arrive at a final top-line number for what driving, walking, and biking cost, but I feel like none of that really matters unless you understand what the components are. They identified 14 different parameters to include, and I won't go into detail on all of them because some of them just don't have that much effect, but what I'll do is walk through the interesting stuff and total things up as we go. Let's start with vehicle operating costs, so maintenance and depreciation, insurance, fuel, basically all the stuff I talked about in my earlier video on this topic. The paper analyzes everything in terms of euros per kilometer, so I've translated all of that into dollars per mile. They're showing 37 cents a mile for driving, and I don't know, the IRS mileage reimbursement rate is like 65 cents a mile this year. The paper is from 2019, and also maybe European cars are just more fuel efficient on average, but it does strike me as a somewhat conservative number. The biking and walking operating costs are just kind of funny. Like, I looked into it in the appendices, and this is literally supposed to be the cost of footwear. And I have to admit, I've never actually thought of amortizing my shoes across the number of miles I walk, and I probably still won't. Travel time, this is a bit of a weird one. Value of time varies a lot from human to human and from situation to situation, but it is something we attempt to put a value on in transportation analysis. And I guess you could say that this is where driving really has its moment, with significantly lower cost per mile than for people walking and biking. And I don't doubt that it's literally true when you measure it that way, but I think it's also true that people who replace driving trips with walking and biking trips have much shorter average trip lengths. This detail about travel times from the paper is interesting though. Cyclists are known to engage in detours to avoid negative externalities of the car at a considerable time cost. This also applies to walking. So the paper calculates all of that as quote-unquote free flow travel time and splits out congestion as a separate component. And this is an externality that drivers impose on each other and on goods movement, and it actually ends up being the biggest line item on this whole thing, which wasn't intuitive to me, but when you really think about how our transportation system is set up, it just starts to make sense. Like, our roadway system really is a free-for-all where an Uber Eats driver delivering a fried chicken sandwich gets to impose delay on a delivery truck carrying like $1 million worth of semiconductors. It's just wild stuff. This particular component is not considered to be an externality of biking or walking. Okay, those are big ones, but that's just the beginning, and there's way more interesting stuff still to come, including the top line numbers, and what happens when you multiply these numbers by the number of miles that Americans actually drive. Yikes. But first, brief reminder to click on all the stuff if you want to spread insidious ideas about the true costs of American car dependency, and follow on the apps if the weekly frequency just isn't enough. I honestly can't imagine. And direct support on Patreon really does help keep the content spigot turned on. Okay, let's move on to a really interesting one. Land use and infrastructure. 12 cents a mile, which just seems low to me intuitively. The number is mostly based on an estimate of the additional land area you'd need to acquire each year just to keep up with the annual growth in driving and parking demand, times an estimated average land value. So the framework doesn't really account for the massive proportion of our cities that's already dedicated to traffic and parking infrastructure. And the paper acknowledges that related impacts like compromising animal habitats and ecosystems isn't included, which seems kind of important but maybe difficult to quantify. For biking and walking, the paper concludes that this cost is inconsequential. Climate change, just 2 cents a mile, which is a bit surprising. The calculation is basically CO2 emissions per mile, with the value based on what it would cost to reduce emissions to a level that's in line with the Paris Agreement, where the goal is to hold the increase in global average temperature to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This one also includes a lot of assumptions about what the fleet is going to look like in terms of electric and internal combustion mix, and I do talk more about how the EU addresses CO2 in its fuel taxes in this video. The next 5, air pollution, noise pollution, soil and water quality, infrastructure maintenance, and resource requirements, each round to about a penny per mile for driving and are basically non-existent for biking and walking. And a penny per mile probably doesn't seem like much, but just keep in mind, for all this, consider multiplying by the number of miles driven in the US every year, because then the cost starts to seem a little more significant. Crashes, I gotta admit, I don't like the way they handled this. They basically said the insurance paid under vehicle operating costs covers the cost of crashes for drivers, so they didn't want to double count. And the cost for people biking and walking is 10 cents a mile. So they consider people walking and biking getting hit by cars a personal cost of walking and biking, not an externality of driving, which I just don't agree with. Perceived safety and discomfort, they did manage to put a dollar value on, but again, they account for it as a private cost of biking and walking when it really seems like an externality of driving. Okay, let's get to the positive part of this, which is health benefits. The study estimates a 67 cent per mile private benefit for biking and a whopping $1.34 per mile for walking. And this accounts for both prolonged life and increased quality of life, or call it increased productivity, although it feels a little weird. Then there's additional external benefit for reduced burden on the healthcare system. But note that the net external benefit gets reduced a bit because they do account for the cost of extended pension payments because the people biking and walking have higher life expectancy. I'll take it. Also, it's weird to me that they don't frame this as negative health benefits for the drivers who are basically sedentary when traveling the same distance. But this is really all about the deltas between the different modes. So the bottom line, the cost of walking nets out at 19 cents a mile, basically because of the high cost of the travel time, which feels weird to me. Like, what was the baseline expectation that people were just gonna teleport everywhere? Biking though actually nets out as a negative cost of 5 cents a mile. So even given the ridiculous travel time cost estimate, and even given that people on bikes getting run over by cars is considered a cost of biking, it's still a net benefit to society. Cars though, the total cost is $1.47 a mile, and hang on, let me do some math. Oh yeah, that's like $5 trillion a year, which to be honest, still feels like lowballing it, but you really could build a lot of trains with a $5 trillion annual budget. Let's see how the report wraps it up. A central conclusion is that transport investment projects in the European Union systematically underestimate the cost of automobility. I'm gonna go ahead and say that this is almost certainly doubly true in the US, and given everything we just looked at, it's fair to say that those of us who walk, bike, and take transit subsidize driving not only with our money, but with our time, our health, and our lives. Okay, those are all the cheery factoids I have to report today. Thanks for joining, and thanks as always to the patrons for your direct support, which really does allow me to do this as a full-time job. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.